January 1945. A winter wind moves across a fenced compound in the American Southwest. Barbed wire hums softly. Watchtowers stand still against a pale sky. Inside the camp, a line of Japanese prisoners waits in silence. Their uniforms are worn. Some are barefoot. Many have not spoken for hours. A truck arrives without ceremony. Wooden crates are unloaded. No guards shout. No rifles are raised. Instead, boxes are opened. Neatly packed parcels marked with a red emblem, unfamiliar to most of the men watching. Inside, bread. Tins of meat. Soap. Cigarettes. Medical bandages. Paper. Pencils. One prisoner hesitates before reaching out. He expects punishment. He expects deception. What he receives instead is food, more than he has seen in months, and a nod from an American medic who does not speak his language. There is no triumph in the moment. Only confusion. These men were taught that capture meant disgrace. That enemies showed no mercy. That death was preferable to surrender. Yet here, behind enemy lines, kindness has arrived quietly, without demand or explanation, and as the prisoners eat, a deeper shock begins to settle in, one that will follow them long after the war ends, rooted in a realization that challenges everything they were told about their enemy. That realization begins far from this camp, in the beliefs that shaped them before the war ever reached American soil. Long before Japanese soldiers ever encountered an American guard or a Red Cross parcel, they were shaped by a worldview that left little room for mercy in war. Imperial Japan entered the Second World War carrying a military culture rooted deeply in Bushido, the warrior code adapted from samurai tradition and reshaped by modern nationalism. Loyalty to the emperor was absolute. Obedience was not questioned. Death in service was not feared, it was expected. From the earliest days of training, Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was worse than death. Capture meant disgrace not only for the individual, but for his family, his unit, and his ancestors. Military manuals reinforced this belief. Field commanders repeated it. Propaganda amplified it. A soldier who allowed himself to be taken alive was considered already dead. This belief was not symbolic. It was enforced with brutal clarity. Japanese troops were instructed to fight to the last bullet, to use bayonets when ammunition ran out, and to take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. On islands across the Pacific, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, entire units carried out mass suicides rather than surrender. Those who did survive capture often did so by accident. Wounded, unconscious, buried by explosions, or physically unable to resist. Survival itself became a source of shame. Just as important as how Japanese soldiers viewed surrender was how they believed surrender would be met. Japanese military doctrine assumed that enemy forces would treat prisoners harshly, because that is how Japan treated its own captives. From China to Southeast Asia, Allied prisoners of war experienced starvation, forced labor, beatings, and execution. Japanese soldiers were told this was the natural order of war. Weakness deserved punishment. As a result, Japanese troops expected no quarter from the enemy. American soldiers, in particular, were portrayed as brutal, racially inferior, and morally corrupt. Propaganda leaflets and briefings warned that capture by Americans would lead to torture or death. This belief was reinforced by the racial hatred that defined much of the Pacific War. Both sides dehumanized the other. Atrocities hardened attitudes. Fear replaced nuance. By the time the United States began capturing Japanese soldiers in significant numbers, after Guadalcanal in 1942, most Japanese troops believed they were already condemned. Early captures reflected this reality. On Guadalcanal, American units discovered wounded Japanese soldiers who refused medical treatment, attempted suicide, or attacked medics offering aid. Some had to be restrained simply to keep them alive. Interrogators noted the same pattern again and again: disbelief that they were not being killed. The shock was not relief. It was confusion. As the war progressed, the number of Japanese prisoners remained low compared to German or Italian POWs. Many battles ended with near-total Japanese casualties. But as American forces advanced across the Pacific, through the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippines, more wounded and isolated soldiers began falling into U.S. hands. Each one carried the same expectations, that capture would bring humiliation, that kindness was impossible, that survival itself was unnatural. What awaited them instead was a system built on an entirely different philosophy of war. One shaped not by honor through death, but by law, logistics, and an international code few Japanese soldiers even knew existed. That system was already in place before the first prisoner arrived. And it would define everything that followed. When Japanese prisoners crossed into American custody, they did not enter a system built on improvisation or revenge. They entered one shaped deliberately by policy, law, and precedent, long before the Pacific War began. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Though Japan had signed the convention, it never ratified it. The distinction mattered. For the U.S. military, the Geneva Convention was binding doctrine. For Imperial Japan, it was largely ignored. American policy toward POWs was explicit: prisoners were to be fed, sheltered, medically treated, and protected from violence or public humiliation. They were not to be punished for having fought. They were not to be interrogated through coercion. They were not to be starved. This policy was not framed as kindness. It was framed as law. Responsibility for POW treatment fell under the Provost Marshal General's office, which coordinated with the War Department, Medical Corps, and international observers. The system was standardized. Camps were regulated. Inspections were routine. As early as 1942, the U.S. began preparing facilities not only in the Pacific but on the American mainland. Camps were constructed in California, Texas, Arizona, Utah, Arkansas, and other states. Often far from population centers, surrounded by fences and guard towers, but operated with strict internal rules. Japanese POWs were segregated from German and Italian prisoners, partly due to language barriers and partly due to the intense hostility that existed between Japanese prisoners and others who did not share their code of honor. The arrival process itself was disorienting. Prisoners were searched, deloused, issued clean clothing, and medically examined. Wounds were treated regardless of severity. Those who had attempted suicide were placed under observation, not punished. Then came something entirely unexpected. Representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Red Cross was granted access to American POW camps under international agreement. Its delegates inspected living conditions, monitored food rations, and ensured compliance with the Geneva Convention. They documented everything. Their reports were shared with neutral governments and, eventually, with enemy states. For Japanese prisoners, the Red Cross emblem was often meaningless at first. Many had never seen it before. But its presence quickly became impossible to ignore. Red Cross parcels arrived regularly. Each contained standardized supplies, food items like canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, sugar, personal items such as soap, toothbrushes, razors, sometimes writing materials, books, or musical instruments. Medical supplies were distributed under supervision. The parcels were not rewards. They were entitlements. American camp commanders understood that Red Cross oversight meant accountability. Conditions could not quietly deteriorate. Abuse could not be hidden. Even guards were monitored. Violations were investigated. For Japanese prisoners conditioned to expect cruelty, this structure created a psychological contradiction: they were not being beaten. They were not being starved. They were not being executed. Instead, they were fed meals that often exceeded what American civilians were rationed at home. They received medical care that many had not experienced even in their own army. Some were allowed to work for pay, under Geneva rules, on farms, in kitchens, or as camp laborers. The system was not perfect. There were moments of tension, mistrust, and cultural misunderstanding. Guards sometimes held prejudices. Prisoners sometimes resisted cooperation. But the framework remained intact. And slowly, an unplanned consequence began to emerge. The longer prisoners remained alive, and treated as human beings, the harder it became to sustain the belief that capture meant dishonor alone. Shame did not vanish, but it was complicated by survival. Kindness was not supposed to exist inside enemy camps. Yet here it was. Regulated. Documented. Repeated. And as weeks turned into months, the impact of that contradiction began to surface in ways American authorities had not fully anticipated, inside the minds of the prisoners themselves. For the Japanese prisoners, the first and most immediate impact of American captivity was not physical. It was emotional. Many arrived expecting execution. Others believed they would be worked to death or deliberately humiliated. Instead, they were given blankets, hot meals, medical treatment, time. This sudden absence of cruelty created unease rather than comfort. Prisoners reported feeling suspended in uncertainty, unsure whether the kindness was temporary or a prelude to something worse. Some refused food at first, believing it poisoned. Others hoarded rations, convinced supplies would soon be withdrawn. The deepest shock came from survival itself. In Japanese military culture, a soldier captured alive existed in a moral void. He was neither alive with honor nor dead with purpose. American treatment extended life without restoring meaning. This produced visible psychological strain. Camp doctors documented depression, insomnia, and withdrawal. Prisoners avoided eye contact. Many refused to speak. Some attempted suicide even after capture, not out of fear, but out of shame, and yet, over time, repeated acts of normalcy began to erode expectations. Meals arrived consistently. Beatings did not. Guards followed routines. Names were recorded. The randomness of terror never came. Human dignity, once broken, did not return easily. But it began to register in small, reluctant ways, through a prisoner accepting a second blanket, or quietly asking for medical help without resistance. The first fracture in belief was not kindness. It was predictability, and predictability suggested something far more unsettling, that the enemy was not behaving as an enemy should. The clash between Japanese military culture and American POW policy was not merely procedural. It was philosophical. In the Imperial Japanese Army, authority flowed downward without question. Punishment was public. Shame was collective. Individual suffering reinforced group obedience. A soldier's worth ended when he failed his duty. American POW doctrine operated differently. Prisoners were addressed as individuals. They were issued identification numbers. Medical staff treated them regardless of rank. Camp rules applied uniformly. This created disorientation. Senior Japanese non-commissioned officers struggled with their sudden loss of authority. Some attempted to enforce discipline inside the camps, organizing prisoners according to military hierarchy and pressuring others to resist cooperation with Americans, but American camp commanders did not recognize these internal power structures. They dealt with prisoners directly. Orders were issued in writing. Compliance was monitored, not enforced through humiliation. For many Japanese prisoners, this absence of ritualized punishment felt like moral chaos. Without visible consequences, obedience lost its meaning. Without violence, authority weakened. Even the act of being addressed politely by guards, through interpreters or gestures, undermined expectations. Courtesy was not part of the enemy image they had been taught. The cultural collision did not resolve itself quickly. But it introduced a destabilizing idea, that discipline could exist without fear. And that idea would spread. If American guards represented an unexpected face of captivity, the Red Cross represented something even more unsettling. Neutral compassion. Red Cross delegates visited camps without warning. They spoke privately with prisoners. They inspected kitchens, barracks, and medical wards. Their reports were written, archived, and shared internationally. For Japanese prisoners, this meant their suffering, or lack of it, was being witnessed beyond the barbed wire. Red Cross parcels arrived with regularity. They bore no national markings. No propaganda. Only supplies. The symbolism mattered. Aid was not coming from an enemy state alone, but from an international institution that treated prisoners as humans first, combatants second. Medical care reinforced this message. Red Cross-approved standards ensured wounds were treated thoroughly. Diseases were monitored. Malnutrition was prevented. Prisoners began to understand that their survival was not accidental. It was protected. This realization carried weight. If the enemy was bound by law, then the war itself operated under rules their own commanders had denied existed. That understanding did not produce gratitude immediately. But it created doubt, and doubt, inside a tightly controlled belief system, was enough to cause cracks that could no longer be repaired. Those cracks would widen as captivity continued, drawing in questions not only about the enemy, but about their own leadership. American policy never defined humane treatment as a form of psychological warfare. But inside the camps, its effects were undeniable. Japanese prisoners had been conditioned to believe that enemies were cruel by nature. That belief sustained endurance in battle. It justified suicide over surrender. It made death meaningful. Humane captivity stripped that belief of its foundation, when guards followed rules. When food arrived on schedule. When medical staff treated injuries without interrogation, the mental structure holding wartime indoctrination together began to weaken. Interrogators observed a paradox. Prisoners were not coerced, yet some began speaking more freely. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But gradually. The absence of violence reduced fear. The absence of humiliation reduced resistance. Kindness did not extract secrets. It removed the reason to stay silent. Some prisoners volunteered information simply to make sense of their situation, to explain who they were, why they had fought, why they had expected to die. These conversations were documented carefully, often revealing more about morale, logistics, and training than aggressive interrogation ever could. The psychological impact extended beyond intelligence value. Prisoners wrote diaries. They taught each other songs. Some learned English phrases. Others asked questions about American society, food, and families. This was not collaboration in the conventional sense. It was human reorientation. By surviving with dignity, prisoners were forced to confront a reality more disturbing than brutality, that their own leaders had misled them about the nature of the enemy, and that realization could not be undone. Maintaining humane conditions did not happen automatically. It required discipline, from American leadership. Camp commanders were instructed that mistreatment of prisoners was not only illegal, but strategically dangerous. Any abuse could invite retaliation against American POWs held by Japan. The policy was enforced from the top down. Officers who failed inspections faced consequences. Guards were trained to maintain distance without cruelty. Emotional detachment was encouraged over hostility. This restraint was not easy. Many guards had lost friends in the Pacific. Some had seen the aftermath of Japanese atrocities. The urge for revenge existed, yet orders were clear. Prisoners were to be protected, even from themselves. When Japanese prisoners attempted suicide, guards intervened. When internal violence occurred between prisoners, American authorities separated leaders and dismantled coercive hierarchies. Discipline was imposed quietly, without spectacle. Leadership inside the camps reflected a broader American strategy: demonstrate moral contrast without overt propaganda. The system itself would speak, and it did. The longer the camps functioned without brutality, the harder it became for prisoners to dismiss their treatment as deception. The system was too consistent. Too documented. Too public. American leadership did not ask prisoners to change their beliefs. It allowed time to do the work instead. While prisoners adjusted to captivity, the Japanese government feared what would happen when they returned. Imperial authorities understood the danger of exposure. If soldiers survived capture and reported humane treatment, the foundational narrative of the war would fracture. The image of the enemy as barbaric was essential to sustaining resistance. As a result, Japanese POWs were declared legally dead. Families were notified of their deaths. Names were removed from unit rolls. Survivors were erased. This policy deepened the prisoners' isolation. Even as they lived, they were mourned. The implication was clear: survival was unforgivable. Yet that erasure could not prevent memory. Prisoners knew what they had experienced. They had eaten the food, received the medicine, lived through kindness that was never supposed to exist. By the later years of the war, American officials recognized that the camps themselves had become silent counterarguments to Japanese propaganda. No speeches were needed. No slogans were issued. The prisoners were alive. And they knew why. As the war moved toward its violent conclusion, the question was no longer whether Japanese prisoners would survive American captivity, but what surviving would mean once the fighting stopped. That answer would emerge in a moment when the war's outcome became unavoidable, and captivity shifted from temporary suspension to a turning point in personal history. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a brutal rhythm. American forces were advancing island by island. Japanese resistance remained fierce, but the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. Inside American POW camps, the shift was quieter, but just as decisive. For many Japanese prisoners, the turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived slowly, through accumulation, through repetition, through the absence of what they had been promised would happen to them. Weeks passed. Then months. No executions came. No starvation followed. No public punishments appeared. Instead, routine took hold. Roll calls happened at the same time each morning. Meals were served on schedule. Medical checks were conducted systematically. Red Cross inspections continued without interruption. For prisoners raised to believe that mercy was weakness, this consistency was deeply unsettling. One documented moment appears again and again in memoirs and camp reports: the opening of Red Cross parcels without supervision, without conditions. Prisoners were allowed to distribute items among themselves. There was no demand for gratitude. No requirement to work. No exchange. That was when some prisoners understood that the system was not temporary. It was permanent. In camps across the continental United States, such as Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp Forest in Tennessee, Japanese prisoners began to ask questions they had never allowed themselves to consider. Why were they being kept alive? Why were resources being spent on men who were supposed to be dead? Why did the enemy obey rules Japan had rejected? For some, the realization came during illness. A prisoner with dysentery or malaria was treated aggressively, sometimes at greater cost than his own army would have allowed. Nurses monitored recovery. Doctors followed up. Survival was not incidental. It was deliberate. This realization created a collapse not of morale, but of certainty. The enemy was not acting irrationally. The enemy was not cruel by default, which meant the war itself was not the simple moral equation they had been taught. That moment, when indoctrination failed quietly, marked the true turning point of captivity. The prisoners were still behind wire. Still enemies. Still far from home, but the internal war was ending, and nothing that followed could restore the old beliefs. The psychological shift manifested outwardly. Prisoners who once refused to speak began to converse. Not with enthusiasm, but with curiosity. Some asked about American families. Others about the war in Europe. A few asked whether Japan would survive defeat. These were not acts of betrayal. They were acts of orientation, men trying to locate themselves in a world that no longer aligned with what they had been told was real. American camp authorities noticed the change. Reports described prisoners as calmer, more cooperative, less withdrawn. Suicide attempts declined. Internal violence decreased. Kindness had not softened them. It had destabilized the ideology that demanded their death. As the war moved closer to its end, with the fall of Saipan, the bombing of Tokyo, and the tightening naval blockade, the camps became spaces where the future intruded earlier than it did on the battlefield, and when that future finally arrived, it would confront the prisoners with a reality no amount of training had prepared them to face. A world in which they were alive, when they were never meant to be. By 1945, the war was visibly collapsing around Japan. American bombers crossed the home islands with increasing frequency. Cities burned. Supply lines failed. Radio broadcasts grew more desperate. Inside the POW camps, news arrived in fragments, through newspapers, guarded conversations, and the guarded silence of American officers who no longer needed to conceal momentum. For Japanese prisoners, the realization that Japan might lose the war arrived before surrender ever came. And with it came a new, unbearable question: what happens to a soldier who survives a lost war after surrendering? Inside the camps, behavior changed again. Some prisoners withdrew, fearing the moment they would be returned home. Others sought education, English lessons, vocational training, anything that might justify continued existence in a post-war world. American authorities, anticipating repatriation, expanded programs quietly. Prisoners were taught basic labor skills. Educational lectures were offered. Literacy programs expanded. None of this was advertised as rehabilitation. It was preparation. When Japan announced its surrender in August 1945, the camps did not erupt in celebration. There was no cheering. For many Japanese prisoners, the announcement confirmed what they already felt, and feared: the war was over. Survival was permanent. Red Cross officials coordinated repatriation lists. Medical checks were intensified. Prisoners were photographed, documented, and prepared for transport. At this stage, the full weight of American captivity became clear. No revenge had been taken. No punishment imposed. Instead, prisoners were being returned home alive, fed, clothed, and recorded. Some prisoners broke down during this phase. Camp doctors recorded anxiety attacks and depressive episodes. The fear was no longer of dying in captivity, but of living afterward. They knew how Japan viewed surrender. They knew families had been told they were dead. They knew returning alive meant confronting shame institutionalized by the state, and yet, the same system that had kept them alive did not abandon them at the end. Repatriation was orderly. Ships were provisioned. Medical staff accompanied transports. Red Cross representatives remained involved until prisoners were formally transferred. For American authorities, this was the end of a legal responsibility. For the prisoners, it was the beginning of something far more uncertain. They were no longer soldiers, they were no longer captives, they were men carrying knowledge that could not be erased, knowledge that the enemy had treated them with restraint. Knowledge that survival had been possible. Knowledge that the war's moral boundaries were not what they had been told. As the ships moved west across the Pacific, carrying former prisoners back toward a defeated homeland, the kindness they had experienced became heavier than any chain. Because it could not be denied and it could not be explained away, what awaited them in Japan would determine whether that knowledge remained personal, or reshaped memory itself. The consequences would unfold slowly, in silence, long after the camps had emptied and the wire had been taken down. When Japanese prisoners of war returned home after 1945, they did not return as veterans, they returned as contradictions. For years, the Imperial Japanese government had officially declared captured soldiers dead. Families received notices of honorable sacrifice. Names were inscribed in local records. Mourning rituals were performed. So when men stepped off repatriation ships alive, the shock rippled outward, through families, villages, and institutions unprepared to acknowledge them. Many were met not with celebration, but silence. Survivors described arriving home to find their own memorial tablets already placed in household shrines. Some discovered widows who had remarried, children who had grown without them, parents who had accepted their deaths as sacred necessity. The stigma of surrender did not end with the war. Former POWs were often excluded from veterans' organizations. Some were denied employment or advancement. Others concealed their captivity entirely, claiming injury or reassignment rather than surrender. What made this silence more painful was the contrast they carried within them. They had lived under enemy control, and had not been brutalized. This truth conflicted with post-war narratives. Japan was grappling with devastation, occupation, war crimes trials, and national humiliation. There was little space for stories that complicated victimhood or challenged long-held beliefs about honor, yet testimonies existed. Quietly at first, some former POWs wrote memoirs describing American camps. Others spoke privately to family members. Their accounts aligned. Adequate food, medical care, Red Cross inspections, absence of abuse, these stories did not spread quickly. They were inconvenient, but they persisted. American records corroborated them. Red Cross reports documented camp conditions in detail. Medical logs, inspection reports, and repatriation records formed an unbroken paper trail. The evidence was overwhelming. For former prisoners, this created a painful inversion. The enemy had treated them lawfully. Their own state had erased them. This realization deepened post-war disillusionment. Some survivors became pacifists. Others withdrew entirely from public life. A few participated in post-war reconciliation efforts, but most carried their experience quietly, unsure where it belonged. The kindness they had experienced did not redeem their suffering. It complicated it, and as Japan rebuilt itself in the shadow of defeat, these men stood at the margins, living proof that the war had been built on myths as much as firepower. Those myths would not disappear overnight. But time, documentation, and international memory would begin to challenge them in ways no battlefield ever could. As the years passed, the story of Japanese prisoners in American camps did not vanish. It surfaced gradually, through documents, testimonies, and institutional memory, reshaping how the war itself would be understood. In post-war Japan, the initial response to returning POWs was avoidance. Survival through surrender did not fit the narrative of noble sacrifice that dominated early Reconstruction. But as occupation reforms dismantled militarism and opened archives, suppressed experiences began to re-emerge. Former prisoners found that their memories aligned with international records. The International Committee of the Red Cross preserved detailed reports from American POW camps, inspection notes, dietary logs, medical statistics, correspondence. These documents showed consistent compliance with the Geneva Convention. They showed oversight. They showed restraint. In contrast, war crimes trials exposed the treatment of Allied POWs under Japanese custody. The disparity was unavoidable. This contrast did not erase Japanese suffering during the war, but it forced a reckoning with how military culture had defined honor through death rather than responsibility. The experience of captivity became evidence not of weakness, but of indoctrination. In the United States, the legacy took a different form. American POW policy became a benchmark. Military manuals incorporated lessons learned from the war. Training emphasized that lawful treatment of prisoners was not optional, even under extreme provocation. The camps were studied not as acts of generosity, but as systems of discipline under pressure. The Red Cross emerged from the war with reinforced legitimacy. Its access to camps, its inspections, and its documentation demonstrated the power of neutral oversight. The emblem that once meant nothing to Japanese prisoners became, in hindsight, a symbol of survival. For historians, the camps became quiet case studies in moral contrast. Not because they erased violence elsewhere, but because they showed that restraint was possible even in total war. The men who passed through those camps carried that lesson into the post-war world. Some testified publicly decades later. Others spoke only once, near the end of their lives. Their accounts rarely centered on gratitude. They centered on disbelief that the enemy had followed rules, disbelief that survival had been allowed, disbelief that kindness had existed where none was expected. That disbelief became part of the war's long echo, challenging simplistic narratives of good and evil, victor and vanquished, because the camps did not change the outcome of the war, they changed what the war meant. And that meaning would only fully settle with distance, reflection, and the recognition that how a war is fought can matter as much as who wins it. In a war defined by extremes of violence, sacrifice, and destruction, the American POW camps were not places of heroism. They were places of restraint. They did not end the conflict, they did not save cities, they did not prevent atrocities elsewhere, but inside their fences, a different rule applied. For Japanese prisoners raised to believe that surrender erased humanity, captivity became a quiet confrontation with reality. Not a dramatic revelation. Not a sudden conversion. Just the slow accumulation of evidence that the enemy was not behaving as expected. Food arrived, doctors returned, inspections continued, and in that repetition, certainty dissolved. Kindness did not absolve the war. It did not erase the suffering caused by Japanese aggression, nor did it diminish the devastation Japan endured. What it did was expose the fragility of the beliefs that had demanded death over survival. The Red Cross parcels, the medical wards, the written records, these were not gestures of sentiment. They were systems of law, functioning under pressure. Proof that humanity could be maintained without illusion. For the prisoners, survival became a burden as heavy as any weapon. It forced them to live with knowledge their own state had denied, that war did not have to erase dignity entirely. History often remembers wars through battles and leaders. But sometimes, it turns on quieter spaces. Where expectations fail, and the truth arrives without spectacle, behind wire and watchtowers, far from the front lines, men learned that the enemy was not who they had been told it was, and in that realization, long after the fighting stopped, the meaning of the war continued to change.